the fear is entirely understandable and natural and normal. And I think it would be an unusual type of person who genuinely didn't feel any trepidation when considering their own mortality. I think sometimes these days there's a tendency for people in a very well-meaning sense to say, look, death is entirely natural. It's the one thing that we're all guaranteed to experience, come what may. There's nothing we can do about that. It's inevitable and normal for every one of us. So why can't we just embrace it and not fear it, not see it as a taboo, and just be very open and accepting of it? And I think, actually, in a way, the precise opposite. I think the enormity of being a living creature who knows from the outset, from the moment we're able to understand these things, that we are going to die, that every single thing we love about this world and the people in it are going to slip through our fingers, whether we like it or not, is astonishing. It's a defining aspect of being human. And I think you can simultaneously think this is normal now and inevitable, and also momentous, because if we love the world and we love the people and the things and the creatures in it, how can we not feel a sense of enormity at having to lose them all?
My work with families, what it has taught me is that the taboo around grief and death comes from fear and a kind of magical thinking that if I think about it or even talk about it, it might make it happen. But then, of course, when people are bereaved, when somebody close to them dies, they and their families and friends don't know what's normal. And so what's already bad is made worse by their sense that somehow they're doing it wrong, or that they kind of thrown onto this alien landscape and they have no understanding of what that should or could be like. And so what I'm hoping that today is a breakthrough festival, the next few days, is that people begin to have an understanding of themselves so that they kind of know internally what happens to them when they're grieving and to know what's normal. And I think societally and across the world, as Lucy said, our mortality is more present than ever before. And my belief for decades has been that we should have as much an examine death as an examine life, and that life and death are completely interconnected. And that if you kind of face your death while you're living, it makes your life more precious, but also you have a much kind of greater depth of engagement with your life. And that we are all interconnected, so that our families, societally, within our countries and globally, we affect each other. And the more that we have compassion, empathy, and knowledge around death and grieving, then support, which is the key that matters most when people are bereaved, is much more likely to be effective and make all the difference in the world.
When a person dies, the love for the person carries on. It's actually
exactly
unrelated to whether the person is alive. The love is like a third object, if you like, created between two people. It still remains even when the person's died.
Yes.
And
and can create a channel of connection then. I said to my granddad before he died, and he was definitely an atheist, didn't think anything happened after he died at all. And I said to him before he died, when you're gone, I'll connect with you through the love in my heart. And he looked at me and said, I couldn't have put that better myself.
Oh, how lovely. yeah.
And it's like that seems to cut through all the kind of what happens, is it real, what, do I believe, don't I believe, all that sort of stuff. It's like we all know love.
And I think probably it's biphasic in life, isn't it, that the midlife crisis is the point at which you start to think not that people who are precious to you might die, but that I might die. I will die. And actually somehow there's a sense now of time passing, the preciousness of time sometimes translates into unfortunate behaviors, and sometimes into behaviors that are much more about embracing what is now and seizing the day. So I think there's a great wisdom from understanding that we're mortal that runs in parallel with that fear of separation, annihilation, or depending on the person's viewpoint and faith, maybe judgment or condemnation, the unknown. And it's the same as the fear of the dark, isn't it? That what we can't see, what we can't know, we imagine, and it's much more frightening than what we know.
In the West in general, there's been a shift away from actually talking about death, discussing it. It's become a taboo subject in itself. People don't even like to think about it, especially in the lifestyles we sort of tend to lead over here. Whereas in Islam, as Sabina said, you are encouraged to think about death regularly, and it's something you actually prepare for. And death is not seen. Obviously, the process of death itself is scary, but death in itself, it just seems a transition from one state to another state. You're literally leaving this earthly realm to go to, I suppose, the next spiritual abode, basically. So people have that understanding. That helps them process death a little better as well. Along with that, you also have, the belief in the concept of destiny, etc. So when someone does pass away, you tend not to get this attitude, oh, why did they have to leave us now? They went too young, too early, etc., etc. You sort of accept that, well, this was their time, this is when they were meant to go, it's God's will, and that helps. And especially when I lost my dad, it was a bolt out of the blue, and it was maybe I'll discuss it later, but it was a real shock to my system. That one key thing gave me the mental tool set to cope with losing my dad in that way. If I didn't have that, I probably would have fallen apart.
I mean, we are the only animals, aren't we, humans, that we know we're going to die. I mean, unless you're a very small child or in some way have a kind of cognitive impairment, which means you can't take on that concept. We do know that we're going to die. And I would say that we all, in different ways, have feelings about death, often in death anxiety, that, what we do with it when we think about it is a number of things. Often our death anxiety gets projected into frenetic activity. Sometimes it's anger, or sometimes it's the recognition that we are also conscious beings, and that life is here to be really lived and enjoyed. And I think that death anxiety is something that we unconsciously largely live with and kind of cope with in our different ways. But when you get a terminal illness diagnosis or not, when you are told that you've got a very, very serious illness, I think that one way that people do cope, and this is what I would define as what happened to us, is in a sort of death denial. And I think that one response to that is to create a kind of magical thinking, almost an idea that if I think about this in a particular way, it won't be the case. And I think that something of that took place. I think it's very common. I think it's a way of dealing with the enormous anxiety of death actually being kind of around the corner, rather than at the end, we hope, of a long-lived, interesting life full of good relationships and all the things that make a life feel very worthwhile. And I think it's a way of denying reality, and I think it's probably very common. And I think it may make things better for the person with the illness, the sufferer. I think what I believe now is that it makes it very difficult for those around. So that fact of not being able to somehow confront a very, very painful and terrifying reality is then something that really can't be thought about. And I suppose the basis of my work is thinking things through. It's listening, sharing often, and it's helping people think about what is frightening or what has distressed them, what depresses them, and so this was a very kind of blunt example, I think, of just not being able to think, a kind of splitting off of thinking.
I really like to ask patients if they might be willing to talk to me about what they're most frightened of, because very often the answer will be very, very revealing. It might be that sense of one's own annihilation. So some people, I'm thinking of Philip Larkin especially, who's written so beautifully about that sort of haunting existential void, the idea that he could no longer exist for the rest of time, appalled him. I think sometimes people, much less commonly in my experience than fear around the symptoms that may accompany the end of life. And as Kathryn says, if we inhabit a society where this is a taboo subject, one that people find difficult to talk about, attempting to shrink away from, which I think is certainly the case, then there's a void into which we can pour our imaginations and start to fear the worst, and nothing feeds fears like the dark. They just expand to fill the void. But sometimes I'm astonished by people's most powerful fear. So I have encountered individuals who have answered that question, what they're most afraid of, by saying, what will happen to my cat when I'm gone, or who will feed the birds in the garden when I'm gone. Things that seem very insignificant and of course, for whatever reason, have incredible importance to that individual, that you can sometimes unpick in conversation. And I find that really interesting, because I think the fear is as diverse as human beings are, and it's important never to make assumptions about what drives it.
Albert Einstein, so he was obviously, probably everybody knows who Einstein is.
We all know Einstein.
We all know Einstein. Probably
We've at least heard of him.
Cleverest
anyway,
man of the. And because of Einstein, really, we know about the Big Bang. Probably we have mobile phones because of Einstein's insight into nature. And he wrote to a friend of his, a colleague of his, died, and he wrote to his colleague's wife and said, "Michelle has left this strange world a little before me. This means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is nothing more than a persistent, stubborn illusion."
Brilliant. Brilliant, which fits in nicely with my thing of love being beyond the time and space scale that we measure things by.
It makes eternal seem utterly possible, doesn't it? And also I think it does something, it changes our sense of ending. Because we think only in sequential time does something finish and then start again. But we know that actually that's just the way we perceive our reality. And the truth is that they are past and present. I think of them as layers, past, present, and future, are all kind of stacked on top of each other. And so the idea of a life ending in some absolute way would seem to be sort of inconsistent in some sense, wouldn't it? With the true idea of time.
Yeah, good hearing a good physicist really naming that.
I think we're very privileged in palliative care because we do unpick that fear with people who are prepared to talk to us about it. And so we'll meet people who say, well, the thing is, she's terrified of dying. Can you come and help? And I will say, and what is it about dying that she's terrified of? And this doctor or nurse is referring will look at me as if I'm crazy. Like, you really think I'm going to ask that? But actually, I'm terrified of dying is the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation. And if we use questions rather than rushing to reassure and calm and console, we can explore those fears in a way that people find helpful, to name it and to explore it, I guess it's a little bit like turning a torch on in the dark, or being somebody's companion in the dark. What is it about the idea of dying that's distressing you the most? And when they tell you that thing, to simply accept that is the thing, and ask what it is about that is distressing you the most. What is it about the fact that nobody will feed the birds in the garden that distresses you the most? Because people end up at the most extraordinary place. So I'm terrified of dying because I've got a picture of seeing my children in the playground on their own with nobody to console them. God, that's awful. I would feel dreadful if that were my picture. But my job is actually to unpick that further. What is it about the sense of them being left alone that causes you the most distress? And when we unpicked that for that lady, it was, there's nobody to tell my daughter about periods.
So it sounds as though...
never guess that, could you?
What did you learn about the afterlife from doing 2 festivals of death and dying, Henry?
Yeah, well, God, what an incredible privilege it was to do that, because I got to talk to a lot of people about death and dying, and I used to be a research scientist, so I'm really interested in just asking people open questions and seeing what they come back with. And really, what I learned was that most people seem to have a sense of the afterlife. If you ask them, they generally come up with something. They don't say, oh, I've got no idea. Or they might say that at first, and then they'll kind of move in a direction towards something, a dream or a feeling or an experience. And so I began to wonder whether actually everybody holds internally an idea of the afterlife that is theirs, and perhaps it's quite precious and quite tender, and we don't really want to expose it necessarily, but it's intimate, isn't it? But nevertheless, it's there, and it's ours, and it's our natural, authentic arising of almost like a sense of direction of the afterlife. And so I was quite interested in thinking about how that could be developed, and really with the aim of making friends with the afterlife, so that we might carry a sense of what the afterlife is for ourselves as we go through life, and possibly as our loved ones are going through the end of life. If we are holding a sense of where they're going, I think that's comforting.
And they may also fear that they have reached the point in their life where they are now dying with a capital D, and that means somehow they're no longer living, that their life is only going to be filled with painful, horrible things from this point onwards. Whereas, of course, I would argue in a profound sense, we're all living and dying simultaneously from the moment we're born. We're mortal. Inevitably, our life is going to come to an end. And even if you only have a few weeks, days, hours to live, it is still possible to have meaning and valuable and precious and maybe even beautiful experiences in that time. So a lot of what we'll be trying to do is invite a different, a kind of receptiveness and an openness and an imaginative leap to a different kind of narrative, and that can be really, really positive for patients. In the vast majority of cases, even in an inpatient hospice centre, which is where the most complicated patients tend to be with the most difficult symptoms, it's rare for a patient to suffer terrible pain or loss of dignity or symptoms that are really unbearable. That genuinely is a rare occurrence, and we have really good drugs and medications now to help patients be very comfortable and able to enjoy their remaining life and time in the absence of horrible symptoms. But I guess maybe more profoundly, sometimes even if symptoms aren't a problem, people feel this desolation that goes hand in hand with this idea that you don't have an onwards trajectory. So normally in our heads, we're living in the present, we're trying not to be too ruminative about the past, not consumed by regret. And we're also looking ahead to our futures, and our future narrative is very important to us. Where will I be in 5 years? Will I have grandchildren in 20 years? All of those things. If you have no onwards trajectory, that can be very, very hard to cope with psychologically. So our attitude is very much, even if you only have a week to live, what can we do to enable you to really live that life to the fullest? And that might be enjoying a really beautiful glass of champagne with your family, or having movie night with your kids snuggled up with you on a bed, or bringing your pets into the hospice, or getting you out if you are a patient who has loved fishing your whole life and you might not be well enough to fish, but you really want to see the riverbank one more time. Then our job is to wrap you up warmly, get you into a wheelchair taxi and get you out to the river, and we'll move heaven and earth to make that happen. So any way you can help patients feel as though their life is still something to be lived onwards into the future can be so precious, and it's a really important part of what we try to do.